Greetings, everyone. Welcome. I'm pleased to see you all at tonight's event, Black and Native Citizenship, the Making of American Identity in the Past and Present. My name is Ty Jones, and I am the curator for American history at Columbia's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and also the associate director of the Lehman Center for American History. This conversation tonight is sponsored by the Lehman Center, which is a collaboration between the Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the Department of History. The center is dedicated to supporting and enhancing the study and teaching of history here at Columbia, and in particular, our program attempts to engage historical research and scholarship with pressing contemporary issues and debates. The Lehman Center is hosting two more events later in the semester. On March 23rd, we have a conversation entitled Up Against the Law, Radical Lawyers in the 1960s and 1970s, featuring Luca Falciola, Jeremy Varon, Johanna Fernandez, and Michael Tiger. And on April 25th, J.T. Rohn will join us to discuss his new book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place. And you can learn more about these on our website, and we hope to see you there. Tonight, we are joined by three eminent scholars and authors. Elizabeth Ellis is an assistant professor of history at Princeton University. She is the author of The Great Power of Small Nations, Indigenous Diplomacy in the Gulf South, which examines the formation of Native American nations in the lower Mississippi Valley. In addition to her work on early America, Liz writes about contemporary indigenous issues and political movements and is committed to organizing and fighting for indigenous self-determination. She is an enrolled citizen of the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. Caleb Gayle, who's joining us on Zoom tonight, is an award-winning journalist who writes about the history of race and identity. A professor and senior fellow at Northeastern University, he is the author of We Refuse to Forget, a true story of Black Creek's American identity and power. Gayle's writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Time, The Guardian, The New Republic, and the Boston Globe, among many other publications. He is currently serving as a Walter Jackson Bate Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. And moderating tonight's conversation is Michael Witgen. Michael is the director of the Lehman Center for American History and a professor in the Department of History and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia University. And he is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. He specializes in indigenous and early North American history, comparative borderlands, and the history of the early American Republic. His publications include An Infinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Early North America, and Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
So I'll just say a few words real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Caleb and to Liz, who will kind of give you a brief presentation, and then we'll try to open the floor early to make this more of a conversation than just a talk. When Ty and I first started talking about putting together something for the Lehman Center as we're coming out of pandemic and doing something, I thought what I'd like to do is maybe try to get people together in a conversation about thinking about U.S. history, what happens when we sort of center Black and Indigenous stories in the larger sort of U.S. history project. And as I kind of posed that as a question, I started getting the answer really fast, which is that people get pissed off and they get angry. Look at Ron DeSantis to push back on the 1619 project and so on. And so I thought, okay, well that seems like a good direction to go because we're making people angry. And when I was thinking about these works, both Caleb's work and Liz's work, were exemplary works that I thought kind of spoke to the question for me. They both are works that start out looking at the sort of origins of the colonial projects in North America, and then take these histories from that colonial project period through the early national period, the Republic, and then with a through line into how these stories still are resonating in contemporary communities today. And so that through line from the earliest moments of North American history through the formation of the United States as a country into the present day, and how stories of Black and Native people, how their dispossession, enslavement, identity formations have all shaped understandings of concepts like race, nation, citizenship. And these were just two excellent books that took us all the way from these sort of colonial origins to present day that speak to why it's important to sort of center these stories if we're going to think broadly about North American history. So we're really pleased that you guys can come up. We'll have them, I asked them to talk about the recent book project in this kind of milieu, this context, thinking about the sort of entanglement of Black and Native history and American history. And we'll have them both present some of the work, and then we'll kind of open the floor to discussion. So with that, we're going to have Caleb go first. He's coming to us on Zoom, and I'll turn it over to Caleb.
So when I moved to Oklahoma, as the son of Jamaican immigrants who knew very little about American history, there was a moment very early on in my schooling. I think I was in 4th or 5th grade, where we all would line up in the very back of the school, this massive yard that would one day become a football stadium. And we were all given kind of these very fancy red wagons. I don't remember what they're called, but the very nice ones, the pristine ones, the ones that growing up first in New York where there was no grass for me to play on, that one could never access. But these were the nice ones. We had protractors, the math department, the history department, social studies, English, everyone was there. And the goal was to prospect land that we had been given by dint of law, right? It was a reenactment of the land run, right? And of course, like at that age, without the context of history, which had been not only kind of by happenstance extricated from our history books, but very much on purpose kept out of any sort of present dialogue, there was no way for me to know how harmful what I was doing is, especially given that the land in which we were doing it once sat under the jurisdiction of the Muscogee Creek Nation. That we were actually reenacting a harm that felt, for almost everyone there, except for the kids who knew that history, felt so very distant. But it had a way of haunting us, whether we realized it or not, right? That practice ended, I think, in 2017 in Oklahoma City, just to give you a sense of how recent that is. So part of the reason I mention this is because as a journalist and not a historian, I very much live in remaining incredibly frustrated with how our political dialogue, our social dialogue and discourse, our cultural discourse does not necessarily incorporate any understanding of the fundament of history which envelops us, which remains ubiquitous, right? And so even as a journalism professor, I remain even more frustrated with how limitedly we reflect on history or leverage history in an almost exegetical way. I told you I'm the son and grandson of a pastor, so I'm going to use words like exegesis and eisegesis, and you'll all have to just forgive me for that in advance. But what became clear is that the events that took place in that 4th or 5th grade class were not by accident, but by the erosion of people's access to history. And that, in fact, Oklahoma served and still serves as an imminent expression of what empire and colonialism is even today, right? Even as Kevin Stitt, our governor, or not our governor, I don't live there and haven't lived there in many, many years, almost 20 years now, even as he spends his time trying to extricate even more history, make it punishable by the loss of accreditation of school districts, the drop in funding, the revision of history books and diversity trainings, his desire to erode compacts with a variety of indigenous nations who have for so very long deserved it, the complete abolishing of the historical record such that it is people's ability to access it, to the Tulsa Race Massacre and the way in which that, to some extent, is the imminent expression of Black and Indigenous history. A plain text reading by those of us who have not, subjected ourselves to the trials and tribulations of a PhD in history can still reflect on that history and identify what damage we're actively doing to it today, because we want to tell a very deeply different, almost antiseptic version of American history that absolves us, that puts us all in the position of liberation, when in actuality we're actively fighting any chance for people to access that liberation through knowledge. So I'll pause there because again, I can go on forever, not you all, I can go on forever. And as you can tell, I get quite worked up about it. But I think that, to add just a little fine point on it, perhaps that we might discuss together, I think that journalists suffer from a lack of access to the academy, which is we suffer from the danger of removing ourselves from the importance of integrating history into our understandings of then and now in a way that's super dangerous. And so there are many of us who feel it is our duty to really not so much stand at the gap, but actively spend as much time in the archives, in the lessons of historiography, in oral history traditions, in kind of the cornucopia of historical traditions, and bring that to light so that people, everyday people who are suffering under the kind of erosion of history before our very eyes, not just in Florida with the ever-present Ron DeSantis, but in so many other states and so many other school districts, where people are suffering as a result of this repainted, recasted version of America that eliminates these stories, which often serve as an indictment of America as we understand it and have understood. So I'll pause there and relinquish the rest of my time to Elizabeth.
If this is a good place to roast Governor Stitt, I'm all here for it. I didn't know that was the intention of this panel, but it's a great place to start. So while we get the slides set up, because I am a historian, and so of course I lecture with a PowerPoint, I want to thank Michael so much for having us here and Ty for coordinating this event, and Caleb for the terrific work that allowed us to kind of jumpstart and dive into this conversation. My work on Black and mixed-race Indigenous experiences in America is very focused on the Gulf South and on Louisiana in particular. I recently finished a history of early Native nations in the South, and through this book, I became really interested in the history of the region. And I came to this project working on a contemporary federal recognition project with the Pointe-au-Chien tribe in southern Louisiana. They're located, as you can see here, way down in the bayous of Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish. And Pointe-au-Chien is one of the many indigenous communities that have managed to remain in their Gulf Coast homelands despite hundreds of years of colonial, environmental, and biological challenges. So today, Louisiana recognizes 15 Native nations who are the descendants of peoples who have been in the region for centuries. So this includes Alabama's Biloxis, Chitimachas, Choctaws, Cushatas, Homas, Ishakatacapas, Tunicas, and many other Native people who found ways to evade removal and to preserve their communities and tribal nations. And today these communities have a wide range of hair and skin colors and eye colors, but they all have indigenous roots and identities. And as their Gulf Coast homelands have been dramatically changed in the last 300 years, as has the racial politics and the kind of political landscape of the region, their peoples embody the traditions of this much older Gulf South. Let's see if I can change this. Yeah, okay, great. So here's Pointe-au-Chien today. So although Pointe-au-Chien are one of 15 tribal nations that Louisiana treats as legitimate Native nations, the federal government has denied the tribe's application for formal national recognition. So this is basically a nation-to-nation relationship between the tribe and the federal government. And this is in part because of their mixed-race heritage. Today, the federal government recognizes only 4 of the Native nations in Louisiana as legitimate contemporary nations. And again, this is largely based on their mixed-race lineages. And this is why understanding the deep history of the South and much older patterns of what constitutes indigenous nationhood, identity, and belonging is so important, because contemporary race and blood ideologies that restrict indigenous citizenship at the national level really don't map onto these much older ideas and patterns of indigenous kinship and belonging. And these are the processes that were crucial to ensuring the survival of so many of the diverse Southern Native nations. And of course, this has real consequences for contemporary Native nations. I mean, not having federal recognition. And so my work as part of this discrete advocacy project led me to some major historical conclusions. Let me get the next, yeah, perfect. So this is Louisiana today with some of the contemporary tribal nations here. So the big questions I had going into this were, how is it that Native people end up surviving in the Gulf South for more than 300 years through colonization and dispossession? I'm much more familiar with the histories like my own nation's that end with removal in Oklahoma, dispossession from the East. So how is this so different? How do we end up with so many multi-ethnic and mixed-race Native communities in Louisiana? And finally, why don't we know these histories? To Caleb's point, what's the real story here, and why is it that these histories are not things that we talk about, even as Native people remain omnipresent in the Gulf South? So my book basically argues that the small Native nations who lived in this region, you can see folks on the slide here, there are about 40,000 people in this region at the turn of the 17th century, but that the Native nations in this region's immigration policies and alliance networks enabled them to exercise powerful influences and survive the onslaught of colonization in the Gulf South. So basically, Native Southerners survived in part because they were able to build diplomatically and economically strong nations over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. And here Michael and I's work overlaps in terms of thinking about how Native people in turn influenced and shaped and limited European empires. Basically throughout most of the 18th century, so throughout the era of French Louisiana, Spanish Louisiana, British Louisiana, Native people remained the demographic majority. In 1763, which is the end of French Louisiana, there's only 4,000 French settlers and 5,000 enslaved Africans next to a population of about 30,000 Native people in the region. But to get back to the central question here tonight about belonging, another key part of what makes Native nations powerful and helps them survive these multiple waves of colonization is their practices of taking in refugees, migrants, and outsiders. This is what I called immigration policies. So people throughout the 17th and 18th century who continually brought in folks who did not look like them, who did not necessarily speak the same languages, and who were not coming from the same ethnic backgrounds. In this era, so at the end of the 17th and then the early 18th century, indigenous people in the Gulf South were experiencing tremendous turmoil in their homelands. Waves of disease brought by European settlers, slave raids designed to grab indigenous captives, mostly women and children, to be sold in English markets in Virginia and Carolina, and the political turmoil caused by colonization of the eastern seaboard meant that many people were forced to flee their homes, to escape violence, and many communities lost huge portions of their families to disease, war, and turmoil. And I think maybe Caleb will talk a little bit later about these kind of overlapping experiences of Black and Indigenous enslavement and sort of the entangled past there. But basically, to survive, Native people integrated and adopted outsiders. They did this historically. This was an important part of how people survived. They took in migrants and refugees and folks who arrived on their shores and in their homelands. People continued to govern themselves. So these are all autonomous nations, but you can see even here, there's clusters of nations that are living together for defense and protection. These are people who speak different languages and who are very used to dealing with outsiders and folks who look different. And in the 18th century, they added a new group of immigrants to these pre-existing multinational political settlements. Let's see if I can get the next slide. So here you can see French villages integrated right alongside Native people, right? These are people who are racially different, who speak different languages, who are settling alongside and within Native communities. And this was not anomalous. In the 19th century, these outsiders increasingly included numbers of Black and white Americans who sought refuge in these communities and who married in. Effectively, Native people keep taking in people who do not look like them, who do not speak their languages. And there's not, in sort of early America, we often talk about the fact that Native people differentiated outsiders based maybe on their hairstyles, on their dress, on their culture, on their national affiliation. But skin color was not the primary way that people thought about difference or belonging. And this meant that indigenous nations were willing to take in people who we would perceive to be racially different than themselves. So if we understand the fluid, expansive, and integrative modes of making Native communities in the 17th and 18th century, then this early history demands that scholars confront the discord between historical indigenous notions of belonging and race-based citizenship requirements that undergird contemporary U.S. Indian policy. And I'll just kind of end with a reflection on contemporary recognition requirements and what that does to the ways that Native people frame themselves as either ethnically or racially, homogenous, or insist on a kind of narrative here that says to be authentically indigenous, you have to have, all kinds of dominant sets of one kind of blood. So contemporary federal recognition requirements, which are federal governmental policy, sees the incorporation of outsiders into indigenous communities as a problem and a weakening or lessening of Native nationhood. So somehow by integrating outsiders to grow and sustain our nations, we bleed out and lose our indigeneity, and our land and sovereignty basically can be therefore liquefied alongside with this dilution, right, of indigenousness over generations. And on top of this, many of the nations that have historically struggled or currently struggling to secure recognition because of the perception that they're racially mixed, and especially because of the damning series of 20th century anthropological reports that found that many of the people in Louisiana were mixed race or had too many black folks among their communities, is coupled with this really significant erasure narrative, right? Of all Native people are gone from the South. There's not even supposed to be Native people here anyway. So people who look black or look white to outsiders and who are in places of the country where Native people are not supposed to be, surely they cannot be Indian. And the final thing I'll say, because I am also cognizant of running long, so I will actually cut it off after this, this slide. But the final thing I'll say is just that the key part of this process of erasure is not it's not specific to Louisiana. If we think about the experience of Pamunkeys in Virginia, Lumbees in North Carolina, Choctaws in Mississippi, Tunica Biloxi's or Pontchartrain folks in Louisiana, there are so many of these mixed race and Black and Indigenous experiences that have led to stories of exclusion and multiple kinds of marginalization, both because we're not telling these histories of Black and Indigenous interaction and coexistence, and also because we expect Native people to be bound and confined to certain parts of the country and not to continue to live on the East Coast, in the Gulf South and elsewhere. Okay, let me escape my PowerPoint, thanks.
So I guess we'll kind of shift here to taking questions and kind of having a conversation about the way these scholars have sort of presented their work and ideas. But I guess I'd like to start off by asking them to think about, to the extent to which thinking about indigenous dispossession and slavery as things that occur simultaneously but are interconnected has impacted the work that they're doing. How has that shaped how you're understanding the shifting concepts of race that define indigenous identity? And can you think about the shifting concepts of race and racial identity linked to Native authenticity as it relates to sort of both dispossession and the historical process of enslavement and the interaction with people in the Gulf South, especially with chattel slavery?
Are we starting with me, or are we starting with Liz?
Yeah, we can start with you, Caleb. You've got your story is really ripe for this kind of stuff. So why don't we start with you?
Sure. And there were many questions in there, Dr. Witgen. So I'm gonna try my best to thread the needle with hopefully a through line that works. So I mean, I think we can. I won't bore you so much with the detailed narrative that kind of would demonstrate the kind of confluence of indigenous dispossession and the rise of slavery. But I think like a useful way of capturing kind of the collision of how limitedly, right, colonial power saw both indigenous identity and Black identity, and perhaps kind of what some would consider kind of Black indigeneity, is really quite clearly expressed, somewhat where Liz left off, and kind of where parts of my story begin, right? And I think one of the best ways is I distinctly remember first meeting a lady named Johnny Mae Austin, who had for her very long, over 80 years of living, had known herself to be an active citizen of the Creek Nation, never really paying much attention to her distinction on the Dawes roll as a freedman, right? That didn't quite ring true to her, right? She never really understood it, never considered it. However, when in 1979, roughly in 1980 for her, when she noticed that starting back in 1979, she stopped receiving notices from the Muscogee Creek Nation. She stopped getting notices about events happening, votes coming up. she kind of had this very interesting refrain where she said, "Look, I'm no longer getting mail." And it took a lot of unlearning for her to realize that it was because her entire lineage, her ancestry had all of a sudden become designated as strictly freedmen, which kind of added the stain of slavery to her that historically even her ancestors and her ancestors' counterparts within the Muscogee Creek Nation never asked for, really never recognized near as much as she did, nor her ancestors did. So essentially, like what I'm getting after here is that her family was subject to a variety of kind of shoddy genealogical, unscientific but labeled as scientific tests to determine the degree of indigenous blood that ran through their veins. And quite frankly, it was because her ancestor, Rose Simmons, was considered roughly a bit too, quote unquote, dark to be a part of the Muscogee Creek Nation on the by blood roll. She was designated as, she had to have been a descendant of a slave. There's no other way in which that could happen, despite the fact that so many within the Muscogee Creek Nation had no impetus or desire to kind of create these distinctions or classifications, because as Liz was talking about, skin color was not a sufficient means of separating people, especially when questions of survival were at stake, or questions of survival needed to be answered in very real ways. So for even someone like her, she could trace very clearly when portions of her family, given the lightness of their skin, the fairness of their skin, were labeled on the or placed on the by blood rolls, and others were placed on the freedmen rolls, which then again became the stain of slavery, which for so many of them didn't have the sort of hereditary qualities that oftentimes chattel slavery did, right? That by dint of being accepted into the nation, you kind of lost a lot, or if not all of the vestiges of slavery that once saddled you within the world that was trying to define the Muscogee Creek Nation at the very same time. So I think that the story of Johnny May Austin, of course, you guys have to forgive me, I'm a journalist, so I'm going to go to a Virgil to help do a lot of the work for me to help synthesize what oftentimes can be a very complex story. But in the case of just that person, Johnny May, representative of so many more, we see kind of the difficulties, the unforced errors that are created on the part of the US government to try and affix people to notional categories that they didn't ask for, nor did they have any part in creating.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think that there's, to kind of jump back in time as the designated early person, I think there's a really important ideological process that happens at the end of the 18th and into the 19th century, which is that native nations, right, that are sovereign foreign political entities throughout the course of the 19th century get turned into racialized ethnic minorities, right, incorporated within the United States, excluded, as you read about a lot, or included based on citizenship, right, over this process. And so there has to be this kind of ideological work done to make sovereign foreign nations, again, into racial minorities. And I think about Louisiana in the 1790s as a real kind of pinch point, right? This is in the same era as the cotton gin is invented. This is during the expansion of plantation slavery in the Gulf South. This is right after the American Revolution, when the American state is kind of on the verge of expanding into this region. And we can see really clearly the expansion of indigenous dispossession, lack of recognition, and the hardening of racial lines, all at this kind of critical confluence when land in the Gulf South is at a premium. So indigenous people who are smaller nations, so people who are not Creek or Choctaw or Chickasaw, in the region are largely categorized, described by contemporary observers as wandering savages, right? As these people who are destined for extinction, certainly don't constitute nations, but are excluded from the state based on their supposed savagery. in this era. Concurrent with this, we have, and this of course enables people to say, well, if you're a bunch of wandering savages, then you don't have clear land claims. And so it enables land offices to issue patents and let people move into this region. Concurrently with this, people who were indigenous and enslaved, who lived with enslaved African people or Black enslaved folks, their children are increasingly just categorized as Black and enslaved. And we actually know this because in Spanish Louisiana, there's this process by which people can theoretically sue for their freedom based on having indigenous descent. And we have a handful of court cases where people who are just labeled as Black, right, or just labeled as kind of Black mixed race are able to prove their indigenous ancestry. But those court cases get shut down in 1795 because they're too detrimental to the plantation system. And so we can really see this confluence of the desire for native land to support African slavery in these hardening racial boundaries, right, in ways that say you are either indigenous or you are Black. There is not space for you to be both, and Blackness is conflated with enslavability in the Gulf South, and indigeneity is conflated with the inability to participate in the Republic or to hold land. Which is a little bit different than some of what's happening in the Great Lakes and the other parts of the country. But I think that kind of the power of the plantation South and those Black and white binaries that will lead us by the 19th century to think of the South as a region that's defined by Black and white boundaries and that's it, are really sort of in flux in this kind of early national period.
Can I add to that really quickly? Yeah, I think to even carry that even forward. The invention of Oklahoma, right, is kind of the extension of the invention of Oklahoma, which of course is also the probably some of the most drastic losses at that time of land owned by those who were removed west, is kind of the ultimate extension of the identification of people as a racial group, and minimizing their autonomous nationhood into a racial category, right? That it becomes weaponized as a way to open up land for those who are hungry for opportunity in the West, and then pitched as an everyman's opportunity, right? And if pick up whatever you have and go west to Oklahoma to get yours, to get your stead in the fundament of this country. And so to some extent, like the savage's designation, kind of just became, I would say almost to some extent less benevolent in its articulation, right? It became even more brusque in the invention of what we now consider Oklahoma, right? That's why it's so hard to reckon now with truly the essence of what the state was meant to be, right? It was meant to kind of marry even further removal and extermination and minimization with, or at least to gloss it over with, the opportunity set available to people who perhaps couldn't find opportunity elsewhere. So the wandering savages component became the landed savages who then needed to give up that land that they held to ensure opportunity. And they use very clearly, as many of us in the room, big air quotes on in the room, but for many of us in the room who we understand to be like very clear race-based categorizations to minimize who had what, to privatize even further who had what. And so to some extent, I think that Oklahoma is kind of the kind of radical, almost in the minds of those who wanted to further colonize the West, a natural kind of extension of a lot of the work, what I growing up would be called nasty work, of those who sought greater empire West, as Liz was just talking about. But I'll again, as Liz and I can demonstrate, we could go on like this for maybe the night, maybe tomorrow, and a few other days. So I'll pause there.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor for questions.
Or we're just going to keep talking about Oklahoma. So take your pick.
Hi. Well, it's not really a question, but as I was hearing you describe, Liz, especially the idea that the sort of strategies that people use to survive of sort of integrating more and more people into the group was then used later against them as a kind of strategy to prove that they were no longer, had standing as a nation. It reminded me of conversations that you often hear in conversations around reparations for slavery, where people who cannot point to marriage records, census records, property laws, all of the kind of established controls that would allow people to prove their descendant or to allow them to make property claims today were often the very things that they were excluded from in the time. So it seems to me that there's sort of a parallel process there by which the things that were making people's existence difficult in the moment, or the strategies that they were using in the moment or were used against them in the moment, are now the very things that are being kind of held up against them as they make claims today. So I don't know that there's a direct comparison there, but it does seem like there's an interesting kind of process at work there about how these strategies are still being kind of manipulated in the present moment.
I do think, I will just say that I think that this is not, it's very intentional, right? As Caleb was saying, in terms of access to land and who is included and who is excluded. Oklahoma, very famously in the 1890s, is allotted. What that means is that tribal reservations are chopped up into individual kind of land holding parcels as part of this civilization program. And so many Native folks, my own community included, people received, based on a patriarchal head of house, small plots of land. And so the less blood that you could say somebody had, the less likely they were to qualify for the minimums to get that parcel of land. And this also leads to the huge exclusion of Afro-Indigenous people in Oklahoma, right, by saying, who makes it onto the rolls, who gets land out of this. And we can see today, through the McGirt cases and all this litigation over the real importance of Native nations being able to continue to hold on to land, right, and reservations. There's all kinds of significant governance things. But I think the fact that the ideology, and when we talk to Native people, Black Native people, white passing Native people, it's always the how much, what percent, just reinforces this kind of conversation that it's not about political rights, it's not about sovereignty, it's about some kind of blood that can be bled out. I think if you use this to talk about the US, we'd all think we were bananas, right? Nobody would say that what territory the US and citizenry the US possessed in 1790 was the sum total of what it was ultimately going to conclude. We often think of expansion of US territory and population as what makes the US powerful, while we can critique the empire part of that. And so it's very intentional that it doesn't apply the same way to Native folks.
I think my question is along the lines of what Professor Jones was saying, but I was really taken by your point about the really kind of hardline binaries between black and white. And I think it made me think about not reparations per se, but just the way that I guess black nationalist movements make claims about politics, which is in terms of its framework is within that binary. But it seems like there's a tension between maybe how nationalist arguments are made and kind of what you're saying about erasure. And so I guess the question is is there a way that I guess, whether it's nationalist rhetoric around reparations or other things, is there a way that can be useful and not participate in erasure? Or do you think that there's just an altogether new paradigm that would be more useful? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, that is quite the question to answer as how to fix this all, right? I'm going to tag Caleb to jump in after this and save me from what I'm sure is about to be a very insufficient answer. But yeah, I think sometimes we fall into the trap, and this is a thing I've heard so many times, right, of saying, well, if we're serious about land back, right, and we give land back to Native people, that excludes all kinds of other people who have very serious demands on the state, right, who also have rights to be here, to have territory, to have sets of reparations. And so I think getting out beyond that kind of all or nothing. We often joke in Indian country that the kind of land back is when folks are like, oh God, you're going to kick everyone out, it's like, that's not typically what Native people did. That might be a reflection of your own sentimentality, that you think that means that nobody else is entitled to participate here. I think, in the case that Caleb talks about, there's very specific claims, right, that Black Creek folks can make on the Creek Nation for, and Choctaws and Chickasaws for like rights for citizenship, for belonging, for monetary. So I don't actually think they're mutually exclusive at all, because I don't think that the project is land back to kick everyone else out. And so it's not really as, I don't see it as binary as that. A lot of it is, when we say land back, is talking about control of the relationships. So, right, who governs that territory? What kinds of environmental protections can we put on? Who gets to make decisions about immigration is basically being able to make those choices, as opposed to like a hard, this or that. And there's, a shortage or a scarcity, I guess, framework.
Yeah, I think the scarcity framework is perhaps like the most corrosive element to a lot of these conversations, that we often have a tendency of not calling out actively, because the scarcity kind of implies a certain, and I don't mean to superimpose like an economics framework into this wonderful discussion, but it oftentimes at least triggers for a lot of people a kind of a capitalist a conversation that is overwrought with some of the tenets of capitalism that didn't enter in near as much to the conversation for not just the Native nations that had land there, had claim there, had autonomous governance practices there, but also to the sprawling number of Black towns that existed before and after the introduction of statehood, and the kind of erasure of what we kind of now consider, or then considered, Indian territory, right? Like if we think about kind of the cooperative advantage perspectives that engage with capitalism externally, but then sought really actively first to identify things like the power of the power of relationships that existed between and within Black communities that established township outposts in places like Boley or Tallahassee or what have you, that really would rebuff the notions, that would wholeheartedly claim elements of Black nationalism, but would rebuff kind of the notions of scarcity that were there, even in times that if you look back at some of the historic record, like it was deeply, some of the resources were in some of the areas that they decided to in some cases colonize or establish themselves, were in fact deeply scarce. They still didn't approach it as such. And that dates back to people who came to Oklahoma, again, after some of the devastation of the land run or during it, by people who came down from Nicodemus and Grant County and Hill City and others, but then those who were there long before, right, in various towns that were designated sometimes by these nations as colored towns or towns where freedmen occupied and were also positions of real political power in a very different context. So I think that the underlying notionality of scarcity is perhaps one of the most dangerous things when we then look back at how people constituted themselves, organized themselves, and operated in a very uniquely autonomous fashion. And this is me hinting towards the next work that the stuff that I'm working on now in the examination of some of these quote unquote Black colonizers that made their way to Oklahoma, and engaged in some practices that were both, in many cases, by all accounts, somewhat admirable, but then in many cases kind of allowed the tools of the master to kind of undo a lot of the efforts that they had put in place when they came to Oklahoma, or rather Indian Territory.
Excuse me. It's so important to be having these political discussions, these historic political discussions at a time when we see such an obvious effort to push the history back under the rug. You referred to it. We DeSantis was in New York yesterday. And so he brought it here to our city. So it's so important to tell these stories. And if I have a question, sort of following up the two questioners that just came before, is how your research is tied to movements that exist right now, people from the communities that you represent, but also have been analyzing. What are the goals that are actually being advocated for right now that people like us can be aware of and supportive of? And if you'll just indulge me for a second, because this is New York, I'm from upstate, and work in, one of the things I do is I work with an organization in the Adirondacks called John Brown Lives, which is, a lot of New Yorkers don't know that the great abolitionist John Brown is buried in Lake Placid, New York. And we've been trying to uncover the history of the Underground Railroad, the black settlements that were created in upstate New York to overcome and attempt to disenfranchise black voters in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And in the course of that, we have been nevertheless complicit in the analysis of this 6 million acre part of New York, which, because it was so wild, there was never a native indigenous population there, which is, of course, nonsense. And we are now beginning to understand that. And so that's my personal example of why it's so important to understand this history. But my political question is sort of what are the issues and movements that are happening out there that we need to be aware of?
I'm gonna kick it to you to start. Go for it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. So there is a tremendous amount of stuff. There's everything from a variety of land defense movements, right? So being able to have safe and livable lands in the futures. Up in Anishinaabe or Ojibwe homelands, Line 3, which is an Enbridge pipeline, is moving through treaty territories, which is imperiling waterways. Oak Flat and Apache territory is one of those mining destinations. Both of these are on tribal lands where the folks there are saying, this is not the development path forward, and they're being hammered with that classic fallacy of Native people versus infrastructure, as opposed to seeing, again, sustainable alternatives, consultation. And of course, Quanashun, which is the community that I work with, just endured Hurricane Ida, has been having tremendous difficulty rebuilding because they don't have access to federal streams of funding because they're not federally recognized. And so most people have been pushed out of their homelands. Very few people have been unable to return. The community next to them, which is Ile de Jean Charles, has been relocated into Houma because oil spills and pipelines have so destroyed the Gulf Coast that people are being truly forced off of their homelands. So I think questions around land control and federal recognition are urgent. The thing that your question made me think of that's actually maybe in some ways most relevant to the conversation that we've been having is that before the Supreme Court, there's a decision related to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And what that is that's legislation that's passed in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the 70s, that basically guarantees that Indigenous children will not be taken out of homes because they are deemed unfit without first giving the option that that child be adopted by someone else within the community or by another Native community. And this is really important because in the 50s and the 60s, as part of civilization and termination policies designed again to end Native nations, on some reservations up to 50% of all children were taken out of their homes by social workers who went in and said, this is an unfit environment, this is an unwed woman, there are too many children in this house. And the arguments put before the Supreme Court, which have been led by like sort of Christian conservative families, are basically this is race-based discrimination, and by not giving your child the opportunity to grow up in a wealthy, often white home, you are racially prejudiced against them. And this is again designed to protect Native children because we know the outcomes of this are so bad. So again, this kind of misunderstanding of political sovereignty as a matter of race has had really insidious consequences for children, for families, for all kinds of stuff today. Yeah, I don't. Well, yeah, intentional misconstruction, you're right. Yeah. It's not so benign.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing with Line 3. There's Line 3, this is similar to Standing Rock, where you've got a line go through reservation communities that they're wanting to end Enbridge or not renew the contract, and it's been a point of contention. There's similar things happening in Canada. I mean, this is could be broadly construed as part of the land back sort of movement, which which is really widely encompassing. McGirt has been mentioned, which was a decision in Oklahoma. Is it Creek or Choctaw? Creek
It was Creek.
Creek, yeah, Creek Tier. So basically, over time, what happens, Liz was mentioning before, with Dawes Act, where they're sort of allocating land per male head of household, taking surplus land and putting it into circulation. That surplus land, by the way, is still being sold into the 1920s and 30s by the federal government from allotments that happened at the end of the 19th century. So in other words, it's been transferred into the public domain even though there's not a demand for it. And so Indian land is then sitting in public domain and being sold off to white homesteaders into the 20th century. So the federal government's not only making money off it, but they're having prevented Native people from having prospered from having land in your family for over 20 or 30 years. But what happened with McGirt is through those processes where white people acquire land in and on Indian reservations, and you get these checkerboard patterns, McGirt said, well, we're not going to take the land back, but we want to reestablish our jurisdiction. And the legal principle behind McGirt was that unless Congress disestablishes a reservation, you can't just take it away. And what McGirt wanted is they didn't want to kick the white people out, as Liz was saying, and that's been the protest. Like, you can't. The protest reaction to this, a similar case happened at Little Traverse in Michigan before. In that case, the plaintiffs who wanted to establish the original boundaries of Little Traverse Reservation in northern peninsula of Michigan, and the same pushback happened. They lost that case, and this was before McGirt. But in both instances, the town people were pushing back. We can't do this because you're going to kick us out, and that's totally unfair. These have been out of Native hands for decades or centuries. And as Liz was saying, the Native people in both these cases in McGirt and Little Traverse were saying, no, our intention is not to kick you out. And as Liz was saying, that says more about where you're coming from. They're just saying we just want to reestablish that we have rights and political jurisdiction within these territories. And so in that sense, adding Native jurisdiction back to these territories would be no different than the fact that you have county jurisdictions and city jurisdictions and state jurisdictions all in one space. It doesn't mean that anybody's kicked out. It's just you're recognizing various levels of authority for different things. And so land back can be everything from thinking about water rights and rights linked to these various pipe things that are going on to reacquiring jurisdiction for territories that have been illegally sort of or dismantled over the time. So it's a huge category of stuff, but being supportive of that and being aware of those sort of movements or things you can check in. The biggest thing probably, though, coming down the court system is the ICWA, Indian Child Welfare thing that's going to be coming up before the Supreme Court, which could really be damaging if it's undone.
I think one more kind of thing to keep in mind that I wouldn't necessarily say to, for you to kind of advocate for, but for the purposes of just being aware of it, right? So with, the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole Nations, I was on a panel last night at NYU Law with Marilyn Vann, right, who is she's the head of the Freedmen Band for the Five Tribes, as it were, and she was the person who led a lawsuit that landed in U.S. District Court in the District of Columbia to readmit or at least to restart the opportunity for freedmen of the Cherokee Nation, right, to people who are descendants of people who were in many cases enslaved by citizens of the Cherokee Nation to regain admittance and enrollment in the nation. She's then since done a whole lot more, like emerged as one of the commissioners on one of their environmental policy councils. But there are a large group of people, Black people, who are still, in the case of the Muskogee Creek Nation, as recently as a week and a half ago, who are still in the Muskogee Creek Nation's court system advocating for readmittance because the 1866 treaty, among the many things that it did do, good and bad, but primarily bad, one of the things that it did was that it ensured that those Black people who perhaps were once enslaved are now offered the same rights and privileges that any of the other citizens of that nation are. But by 1979, the nation changed those rules, and anyone who was on those freedmen rolls, like we talked about earlier, that were designed during the Dawes Commission era, were lost their citizenship. And so it's another thing to be kind of cognizant of, especially within the context of our discussion about Black Native citizenship. It's the question of citizenship, and perhaps whose rules of citizenship are we going to abide by, or how are we going to allow historical influences that were kind of forged in the fires of white supremacy to dictate the ways in which people are or are not allowed to become citizens, or to rather reclaim a heritage and an ancestry that goes back further than the invention of Oklahoma, further than many things, that these bonds that go back so many generations are to some extent, in many cases, by the law, somewhat severed. And so I think those sorts of active litigation efforts are still very much in process, and are forcing certain questions that are particularly difficult for both sides of that discussion. But I think if, as a country, we reflect on those kind of debates that are being had, we would also realize what significant hand the United States has played in polluting what was otherwise an independent way of determining who was a citizen or not. That, quite frankly, the culprit in all of this is very much the United States government, which has not so much been abdicated, but oftentimes is removed from that conversation in a way that's very dangerous and perilous for us going forward, especially about our notions of identity and citizenship.
Can you say something about tribal sovereignty and as to what the scope of it is? And I guess it's a debatable subject. Thank you.
Another really big question. I think that basically, like when I teach classes and I talk about tribal sovereignty, I like Michael, sometimes think it's most helpful to draw an analogy to a state. You know, on a reservation, you set your own speed limits, you make your own decisions about taxes on cigarettes, you can govern, you know, your own kind of development law and that kind of stuff. And so reservation law looks a lot like state law. Technically, all tribal nations fall under the jurisdiction of the US government, although many Native nations reject that and insist on being, you know, recognized as sovereign autonomous nations. One of the things that's really tricky about this question is that tribal nations have had these very different histories. And a lot of what happens for Native people is there's a huge lumping where we sort of assume that Native people all look the same, they all have the same experiences. But of course, there's really big differences between, I mean, you talked about upstate New York before, Haudenosaunee people who have fought hundreds of years of settlers off of their homelands, Dakota people, Anishinaabe folks who are on their original homelands and who have kind of in many areas kept, you know, outsiders out, versus a tribal nation like my own that has land in Oklahoma through its relationship to the federal government on what was originally Quapaw and Osage land, versus land, you know, nations like Ile de Jean Charles that's not federally recognized and that has no land, you know, in southern Louisiana. And I think it's important to remember that the federal government doesn't give tribal nations sovereignty. Sovereignty emerges through Native people's relationships to each other, to the land, to these very, very old systems of governance. And effectively, I think what Native historians and Native legal scholars have been arguing is that treaty law, so law between tribal nations and the federal government, pre-exists the creation of the United States. And treaty law is supposed to be the supreme law of the land. So the United States is obligated, if it's going to respect its own constitution and structures, to maintain treaty law. Now, in practice, we know there's been, I don't know, hundreds of treaty violations. It's hard for me to think of one that hasn't been violated in some fashion, but that if the premise of the US is that it is based on treaty law and acquisition of land with Native people, tribal sovereignty remains relevant and important. And a lot of both legal scholars and kind of organizers would say it's there to the extent that you use it. You got to keep pushing the envelope, you got to keep creating tribal courts, and you got to keep exercising control and sort of reframing the debate, because so often, again, it comes back to this weird conversation about blood, you know, as opposed to being able to talk about international law. Would you add to that?
Yeah, I would. I'm trying to think how to. trying to kind of get this without. I'm trying to stop myself, but I'm going to have to begin with the doctrine of discovery. So, you know, you have Europeans coming to the Western Hemisphere and discovering North America as a continent and construing it as a unsettled wilderness and deciding that it could be divvied up by rights of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, in fact, is one of the things that frames the colonial charters in places like Virginia, where the King of England has granted that charter to that colony by right of discovery. And this is the sort of framework that fits for a while because people are going to say, look, North America looks different than Europe, and we can think of it as a state of nature, but they quickly run into the problem of the fact that there are indigenous people here. And so the whole state of nature argument doesn't hold up as well in terms of granting rights of discovery. When Europeans want to settle, they find it's a world that's densely populated with native people. And so we quickly sort of move into a process where Europeans are still engaged in this colonial project, but they realize they have to deal with indigenous people who have a right and a title to be here, and it ends up evolving into transactions that involve treaties. And there's this, as Liz was saying, there's a tradition of treaty making between indigenous people and outside powers that predates, the United States by centuries. And this becomes the basis by which relationships are established. We kind of fast forward into the U.S. period. Most of the United States, land comes into the United States through treaty processes, because after the Revolution, the United States, with the Peace of Paris, is a given land that's been ceded by Great Britain from the Mississippi through the Allegheny Mountain chains, as well as the original 13 colonies on the coast. And they find that they have this massive chunk of land that's been ceded to them by treaty, but which is still densely occupied by native people. And as they want to expand, they quickly learn they can't do so with just military force without causing lots of damage and problems. So they start engaging in treaty processes to negotiate their expansion. And at the core of the treaty process is the idea that you are two sovereign entities dealing with one another. And while the treaty process is flawed and it's coercive and it's a way in which the United States would sort of steal a continent, nevertheless, at its base, it's an acknowledgement of indigenous sovereignty. That North America was their homeland, and that even as it's being swindled away, at the basis of these agreements are a political acknowledgement of mutual sovereignty. And so, as Liz was saying, for a long time, indigenous people, at the end of this long process from the creation of the United States into the 19th century, 20th century, where territories are broken up and there's very little territory left, it took a while for Native people to start realizing that at the heart of this, there's documents that the U.S. is a nation of laws, right? And at the heart of the nation of laws aren't just things like these, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but also these treaties by which the United States has expanded and acquired territory. And those treaties recognize indigenous sovereignty. And it wasn't really until the late 20th century when Native people started trying to figure out, well, we need to look for ways to mobilize this sovereignty. And they started doing things like creating tribal courts, or insisting on the rights of have gaming, or insisting on being able to fulfill sort of the terms of treaties like fishing and hunting on territories that have been ceded, but in which they still retained rights by treaty to fish and hunt there. So it's been a long process of people figuring out ways in which they can demonstrate, mobilize their sovereignty, and it's gone through this, excruciating process of dispossession. But Native people have never given up sovereignty. It's enshrined in the treaties that allowed the U.S. to expand, and Native peoples have been figuring out how to sort of mobilize that and reassert their place on the continent as sovereign power. It's not as sort of domestic dependence in the United States, or as a weird minority pocket, but as people who have never given up their sovereignty on the continent. So, that's kind of a longer professory
I was going to
explanation.
say A++ job for summarizing Intro to Native History, college course level 100 in 5 minutes or less.
Yeah,
that was outstanding.
Sorry about that.
No, that was fantastic. I will just add to that, since you mentioned the multiple sovereignties thing. Bruce Dutu, who's a HOMA scholar, so one of the nations in southern Louisiana who is facing non-recognition for having Afro-Indigenous ancestry, has made he's a legal scholar, a compelling series of legal arguments basically saying this land has always been a place of multiple sovereignties. I showed you early in the maps the kind of overlapping in peoples who lived adjoiningly, and that has sort of always been true, whether it was Spanish and indigenous, French and indigenous, English and indigenous, American and indigenous, and I think we like to imagine that this is a land of a single legal order and a single set of governance and authority, and it really never has been, and it isn't now.
And I think the work that Liz does, it brings up the points of the indigenous nations that manage to avoid removal because they're smaller nations, because they have this history of allowing in lots of different people, and their sovereignty isn't given away, but they're intact, but they find themselves in strategies that enable them to survive as indigenous nations past the removal era in their homelands suddenly leave them without recourse to sovereignty because the federal government is now deciding who's sovereign and who's not. And so you get those sorts of sovereign struggles. Or in the case of the work that Caleb does, you've got the so-called 5 civilized tribes, people like the Creek Nation, who for the longest time had integrated outsiders, some of whom were of African descent, some of whom were Black Creek, some of whom may have been freedmen. But they also, that nation reaches a point where the demands for, in an attempt to retain their sovereignty, they give into sort of the tenets of white supremacy because they're recognizing that owning slaves can be a marker of civilization, and being recognized as civilized could help them avoid removal, or that continuing to get recognition for their sovereignty might mean that it's advantageous for them to exclude the Black peoples from the roles who've been part of their community, because having a nation that's indigenous or indigenous white is more legible in terms of sovereignty and in terms of nationhood to the majority white United States. So sovereignty gets warped over time in these different ways, and these are one of the reasons why I wanted to give these stories. I think it's helpful to look at that and look at the sort of nuances in which indigenous people, native people, shifting notions about race have changed the way we're understanding these intersecting histories.
Thanks. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I had a question. I was just curious whether you thought your work provided a new vantage point for thinking about one of the preeminent paradigms in Native and Indigenous studies, which would be settler colonialism, right? And I ask this because settler colonialism has really hinged on this stark juxtaposition between the colonist, the settler, and the indigenous people. And it's always struggled, I think, a little bit to think about what the place of African Americans is in a settler colonial society. And it seems like you're potentially troubling that in really productive ways. And I was just curious how you guys might respond to that.
Do you want to take that one first?
I'm gonna let you start because I have a thought, but it's not fully developed. So I'm gonna be the jerk and say, how about you, Liz?
Nice. Well, the person on the panel who's really the expert in this is actually the guy sitting next to me, but I'll stumble for a minute, and then maybe Michael will jump in and Caleb will jump in with something, more intelligent to say. I think to Carl's question, so settler colonialism, right, is the theory that what happens in settler societies is they show up somewhere new, not as immigrants who are respecting the existing social order, but as settlers who are there to erase, remove, eradicate the old society and found something new. And this goes hand in hand with racial capitalism, exploitation of enslaved African laborers, and is a helpful kind of, quick term to talk about the settlement process that evolves in a lot of different places in North America and Australia and in New Zealand, sort of across the hemisphere. So I think it's helpful as a comparative. Okay, I think that one of the things that I'm cranky about is that the field has been a little sloppy about settler colonialism as just kind of sticking it on as an explanatory thing, right, rather than as a theory to provide means of analysis. And what I mean is that I'm increasingly seeing from my students, right, Europeans arrive and there's 12 of them and they're like, oh, settler colonialism, it's over. And you're like, there's 12 of them. There's only 12 of them. This isn't. And so I think where the theory is really helpful, right, is in this kind of discussion about intent and vision and who is respecting what. Right, and so I think that in French Louisiana, which is the region I'm most familiar with, a lot of what's happening is integration of settlers into native political systems. And they can't always control it, and it's not always beneficial, but it's not the kind of overfall. There are huge exceptions to this, like up at Natchez, where a bunch of French settlers try and dispossess a native village to establish tobacco plantations based on enslaved African labor. But yeah, I think that thinking really seriously about the position of enslaved African people, free people of color, Black folks within these sort of early settler structures does unsettle some of these binaries, right? It gives us the opportunity to see Black people who are self-liberated, who are freedom seekers, making it into native territories, reinforcing native jurisdictions, right? Participating in those spaces, creating alternative kind of maroon and mixed race communities and alternative sets of sovereignties there. So yeah, I think that the field as a whole, it is oversimple, right, to say that there are settlers and that there are, everyone who's indigenous. But I think that some of what's really been helpful to me in thinking through these questions about where do peoples who are not settlers fit into society is actually coming out of First Nations communities. We're talking about doing work with immigrants in Canada, right? And so saying, if you are coming to this country, you may be dispossessed, you may not be coming by your free will, you may be stuck under the laws of the Canadian government, but if you are being accountable to the people whose land you're on, right, that is your way of not just reinforcing settler structures, but basically being in relation. Kim Tallbear says that, the opposite of a settler is a relative. It's somebody who's accountable to you, who's in relation to you. So it's not just about like, how did you arrive here and what is your context, right? It's about the kinds of relationships that you build. And I think to go back to, some of what Caleb argues for in the book, these kinds of demands for accountability, right? Accountability from Native people, accountability from settler communities, accountability from Black communities, is really sort of the pathway out of this like hard binary, again, of, land back, get out of here, settler colonialism, you're one thing or another, because I think we miss the relationships part. But maybe y'all want to save me from this.
I mean, I can chime in just to kind of complicate things a little bit more. I don't think there's any saving to do. I think there's no saving to do. I think that was excellently put. I think just to kind of make the story more messy is to kind of look at the lives and legacies of people like A.G. Stacy, Edward McCabe, W.L. Eagleson, who saw Oklahoma in the late 1880s into the 1890s as they had, especially when Liz references an examination of intent. So these individuals who were at the time living in Kansas, becoming ever more despondent about Black opportunity in Kansas, many of whom had been either exodusters or many of whom had kind of come to Kansas to launch their own new political careers in the Old West and business careers in the Old West, had kind of had bought into the notion that the project of Oklahoma as opposed to Indian Territory was still up for debate as to who would own it. So they were almost believing that white people had kind of taken a certain level of control, but there was still an opening before statehood had been really established to have their say. And so, I mean, this is the one quote that I have memorized in part because it's almost alarming, is, Stacy, who is the publisher of something called the Salina Herald, a Black newspaper in Kansas, kind of writes of what McCabe, this former politician and state auditor, the first Black politician, statewide elected politician in the Old West, says, McCabe proposes to found a Negro state in which the white man will be tolerated as a necessary evil, but to whom no political honors will be given. We will fill the state, county, and municipal office strictly with Black people and have only Negro teachers in their schools, right? The intention was to create kind of a home in which Black people would proudly wear the label of colonizer, but they wouldn't, in their minds, be colonizing Indian territory. They would be kind of removing, to some extent, or kind of enacting a certain level of removal against white people who had already kind of done a significant amount of what, again, we would call nasty work, and visited upon a lot of the indigenous communities there. And there is no way in which we could ever view this as something to be valorized necessarily. But I think the story of kind of how all Black towns within Oklahoma emerge presents, and how they viewed themselves as colonialists, as they viewed themselves enacting kind of the same thing that they saw to be successful in kind of the history of the United States up until that point, the history of the West until that point, is, I think, a way of kind of complicating this history that I think could be explored even more, that should be explored even more, because it resituates how we see Black people within this narrative of settler colonialism in the West. But I just add that to complicate the story that much more, right? I think the level of journalistic as well as historical work into these people and what they did is not nearly as robust, right, as perhaps it should be. And I think extending that even further extending our work in that even further might help to complicate how we think of settler colonialism and colonialism in general, and the colonization efforts that the United States oftentimes imposed upon Black people who they believed could not exist or coexist with white people, that to some extent they had given up on the enterprise long before the Civil War had even been completed, that Black people could ever coexist with anyone for that matter. And so to some extent, it was in their minds an innovation to approach the creation of a Negro state in Oklahoma as a way of kind of using the very tools that had been used upon them and others to kind of become the colonizers that they aspired to be. But I think that kind of complicates the story that much more.
I wouldn't add a whole lot to that. I think that the history of these guys definitely complicates the settler colonial binary in a way that's just it's really amazing, because I think actually I'd back up and start and say in the U.S. especially, or settler colonialism in general in North America, is always aspirational. It's not really ever realized, and the U.S. is aspirationally settler colonial, meaning that they want to do that thing where they're replacing natives with the settler population and eliminating all natives, but they never really accomplished that goal. There are some cases more successful than others with Indian removal, for example, but even that is this weird, complicated process that, as you guys talked about, where you're now using indigenous people and Black indigenous people and enslaved Black people to resettle Indian territory in Osage territory, what becomes Oklahoma, which at the time is construed as Indian territory. So you're putting all these people in spaces that you don't imagine are going to be part of the nation, but you're also using them as part of this weird colonial project that's extending them into a part of the country that America maybe would like to acquire sometime, but doesn't think they can colonize. So it just complicates what's going on and how you could, it complicates simple binaries between a settler, usually a white settler, and a native population that's being eliminated. It makes it a lot more kind of complicated about thinking about the modalities of colonialism, how it can implicate people of color, it can implicate indigenous people, as well as formerly enslaved people and enslaved people. Just makes it way more complicated. And I do keep thinking back to this historical model, but then thinking about to contemporary models of settler colonialism, where during the pandemic, when we were having all these people showing up at the border who are with the child separation policy, where people were being sort of separated and put in cages, and most of those people were indigenous. They were coming up from South America, and there's this sort of sense that they don't belong here, but that they're invading our country. And in that sense, it's such a complicated thing to think through in terms of what rights people have and who's an outsider, who's an insider in North America. And it does make me think what Kim Tallboy was saying. If you're going to change those sort of ideologies, an indigenous way of thinking about this is that we're not looking at who's included and excluded, who has a right or not doesn't have a right, but people who are coexisting and how they relate to one another and what their relationships are with the original inhabitants of the land. That seems to be a way out of the settler colonial ideological conundrum. I don't know.
I was just curious, so I'm also from Oklahoma, and I am going into teaching back in the South in lower education, not in higher ed, and Oklahoma, Florida, Texas are all places with a lot of Black people and a lot of Native people, and I was just curious, in those states where like history, I guess, is being challenged and redrawn in like public school systems, what do you think are like ways to continue challenging the narrative of history and pushing forward our stories in kind of those in those public school structures?
That's an awesome question. I mean, I think too, if we're talking about Creek Nation, talking about Tulsa, I think a lot of the reason that we know about, like, nationally, the Tulsa race massacre, right, is because of the huge amount of work by activists on the ground, right, and communities to both uncover these sort of hidden histories, which weren't really actually all that hidden. It was just that nobody was listening, but to revitalize places like the Greenwood District. And I'm thinking of downtown Tulsa, the efforts of Native muralists and artists, right, to create public art installations so that you see this space as increasingly Native, as increasingly Black, right, as a space that belongs to lots of different kinds of people. I think, yeah, it's sort of in public schools and on the front lines. I mean, I'll just say in a lot of ways, just getting that Native people are alive and here today is sort of an incredible hurdle for public school, because often, you know, when we teach college courses, we get students who don't really think that there are Native people contemporaneously in the modern moment, which is a phenomenon that, as you know, probably is still right ongoing. And so I think just really basic sort of these histories, right, of both, you know, both the fact that Indigenous and Black histories are not these two separate narratives of American history, right, but they're intertwined, that Afro-Indigenous people exist, right, that Indigenous people exist, that Indigenous people who are outside of the U.S. exist. I mean, I feel like that would be huge if you could do nothing beyond, I don't know, that, yeah.
Quick question, where are you going back to teach? Yeah.
Dallas?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, good to have another person from Oklahoma in the room. One thing I would say is a few things. One, I think that the efforts to extricate any mention of this sort of stuff in the classroom is a deeply strategic move, right? Like, it's not because there is no repair to be done. There's no legislation to be passed. There's no act to be enabled if people don't even know that any of this happened. There's no conversation or debate of presentism if we don't even know that this stuff happened in the first place, right? So there are, though, even in Oklahoma, and I say this because I'm working on a story for my employer about this. There are bands, there are people, there are scores of parents and teachers and administrators who know better, right? And who have crafted ways of distributing this sort of content, this sort of information that's so critical to people, to students, to parents, to enable different types of people to engage in this, right? So I think to Liz's point, to first acknowledge that these people exist, that they are fully human, and that they can occupy identities that are informed by a larger narrative than perhaps their schools, perhaps their country, perhaps their state government leaders, perhaps their school district leaders want them to believe in, hear, acknowledge, right? So the acknowledgement of those people are super critical, period. Then from there, right, to engage with these large swaths of people, as Liz mentioned, that exist and have existed, who carry these stories with them, who refuse to be forgotten, who are bent on ensuring that people acknowledge both their existence and the indicting nature of their existence. So, you know, I think that for a lot of folks who re-enter those sorts of spaces, there's this fear of isolation and you know, kind of isolation, and then any desire to create community is a direction towards danger and peril. But in actuality, perhaps I think for you, it's an opportunity to find home and community and pleasure in trying to rewrite perhaps the future of these students' opportunities to understand this history, right? And so to me, I think you're engaged in a struggle that involves, as even Liz was kind of hinting at, a global majority that is far bigger than perhaps the small-minded idiots that stand in the way of ensuring that your kids, your parents, get the opportunity to learn about this history, which, if understood, would transform the way in which we think about America in a very meaningful way, and perhaps even the world. So I'll pause there and throw it back.
So my question, and apologies if you addressed this already, but my question pertains to debates that I'm sure you all have been hearing as well about anti-Blackness in Native communities, as well as, Caleb, you mentioned the issue of Black settlers or Black colonizers, to use your term. And I'm wondering, how do we start to maybe get beyond that way of thinking? Because it strikes me that is still rooted in a kind of binary, in the same sort of critiques we might have of settler colonialism. How do we get beyond that while not erasing or denying the extent of that brutality which we know exists?
Shall I start? I have a super brief response. I think it's rejecting the binaries that we didn't inherit from folks who came before us, right? Like, I think that to some extent, like, those sorts of binaries are constructions that have been built very carefully over time by as Michael had mentioned a little earlier, right? Those who forged these notions and binaries kind of in the fires of white supremacy, right? And realizing that perhaps in returning to the far more inclusive, perhaps, than we can even imagine, but the far more inclusive, far more expansive, far more comprehensive ways of being and belonging, by perhaps returning to some of that, might be the best way to kind of reject those sorts of binaries that lead to greater levels of not just anti-Blackness, but a lot of other kind of insidious things that have found their ways into various corners of the ways in which we construct identity in America and elsewhere. So that was the shortest response that I've ever given of this evening. I'm very proud of myself.
You solved it. Now I don't have to say anything. No, I think, I'll speak from the perspective of like my corner of Indian country and the communities that I work with in the South. I think there's a lot of different ways this has to be addressed, because you're right, the pervasiveness of anti-Black sentiment, especially in Oklahoma Indian countries, is huge, right? And it's continuing. And some of that comes out of these legacies, right, as we know, as Caleb writes about, of slaveholding as being perceived as mixed race, as not authentically Indian, of the white supremacy, right, that's baked into recognition of Creek and Choctaw and Cherokee and Chickasaw sovereignty. I think a lot of it is about visibility as well, right? I think about the representations we see publicly of Native folks both in Oklahoma and beyond, right? And the really concerted fight to include more Afro-Indigenous people as like visible, and this is everything from like art to tribal leadership to whatnot. I think that's really important. I think that educating folks, about sort of their early histories and earlier modes of belonging, because I think that a lot of the 20th century and us always having to speak in the language of racial ideologies and blood quantum has really reinforced a lot of this stuff that was not traditional to most of the nations who were there. So I think the sort of cultural reclamation work that many tribal nations are doing might also be kind of a pathway out and around that. And also for tribal citizens, obviously, and leaders to speak up. I think of Ben Barnes, for example, who's chief of the Shawnee up by my community, consistently calling out anti-Blackness in his community from his position of leadership, right? And making this an issue of the administration, which is bold because a lot of parts of that country, of Native communities up that way, are not sort of upfront tackling these issues of internal racism in education. And I think the really crucial other part of this, to return to, I'd started talking about FedRec at the beginning of this, and federal recognition and the kind of anti-Black policies baked into that process, I think is also a thing that forces Native people to frame themselves as not Black. And I'll give you the most concrete example I can think of, which is Tunica Biloxi, which is a community that I've worked with extensively in Louisiana. They were one of these nations that was described as small and wandering and landless in the 1970s. By the early 19th century, they were trying to assert their national sovereignty. They're writing to the federal government. They're excluded in local courts. People are not taking them seriously. And in the 20th century, they're described by anthropologists as, having some Native folks, but largely a mixed race community. The peoples look Black to outsiders, and there's no evidence that these people survived, right? All the Indians are dead. And so when they go through, they got denied and they end up going through recognition in the 1980s. And what Chief Earl Barbary at the time does is he understands how recognition works, and he says to his Black kin and Black community members, we are going to take you off the rolls. We are removing all of you as we go through federal recognition. We will enroll you afterwards because this is what is going to make this work. And you know what? That's the thing that worked for them. I mean, that and the archaeological uncovering of a Tunica site where they DNA tested to prove that it was actually the same group of people who said they'd been there, who had been there the whole freaking time. But anyway, I mean, that's like as clear as it gets, right, in terms of needing to remove Blackness from indigenous communities in order for it to pass muster of the federal government as a racially and ethnically, integrative and homogenous group, and then re-enrolling Black community members afterwards, so that if you saw Tunica Biloxi like at a powwow today, their community to outsiders would look super diverse, although everybody just thinks of themselves as Tunica. So, I mean, it's a big question, but I think there's a lot of levels of stuff that have to happen.
Two very good answers. I don't have much to add other than I think tribes need to start taking control of how they're handling their own membership process and getting away from blood quantum. Which is increasingly happening. It happens in my community. The Cherokee have been at the forefront of doing this, but there's still lots of tribes that do the quarter plus blood quantum. Federal recognition process is still part of their enrollment process. In Canada, it's even worse. The status Indian stuff. It's even worse in Canada with blood quantum stuff. So I think that's it. I think reacquiring, because belonging was never determined by phenotype, and so the sort of adapting your sense of tribal identity to the strictures of white supremacy just is a losing game for everybody. So.
It's also, I desperately want to see tribes trying to adopt in people, right? Because I have a cousin right now who has one daughter, is having, trouble getting pregnant again, and it won't enroll her kid because if she adopts another kid, the adopted kid will never be able to be part of the nation and she will have a mixed status family. Until we can actually naturalize and adopt citizens in normal ways that go beyond this kind of racial fixation, we're just ending up in the same kind of catch points, which is also not healthy or not reasonable, for any sort of citizenship and family continuity and belonging.
Yep. Yep, I think we're over.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.